You are watching programming from the East-West Center in Washington, D.C.
Well, good morning from Washington, D.C. Good evening to our colleagues in Manila and in Seoul and in Kuala Lumpur, as well as throughout the rest of the region. And from wherever you're joining us and at whatever time, we welcome you to this East-West Center in Washington seminar, Indo-Pacific seminar, funded generously by the Korea Foundation. And this is part of a visiting fellows program called Exploring Trilateral Cooperation. And this specific one is on possibilities in the Indo-Pacific, US, South Korea, Philippines cooperation. As some of you know, this has been part of an ongoing series where we've looked at intellectual property protection, we've looked at cooperation on smart cities, and today we move into the more diplomacy and defense realm by looking at possible trilateral cooperation between the United States, South Korea, and the Philippines. We have three terrific presenters. One of them you do not see on the screen at the moment. We are maybe facing some technical difficulties, but we hope to have our third colleague, Dr. Chuping, who join us. But our visiting fellow under this program is Mr. Julio Amador. As many of you know, has had government service in the Philippines, is an acknowledged academic. You have his full bio. But has been a great friend of the center, including being a Fulbright ASEAN Fellow with the East-West Center in Washington as part of a program that he participated in earlier. And we're delighted to have him back and always welcome his thoughts, his insights, and his perspectives. We also have Jae-Jook Park from Hankook University, a real expert on the region and on, of course, Korea's foreign policy in the region. So we're really pleased to have a Korean view. And then hopefully, Dr. Chuping, who is a Korea expert based in Malaysia, will also join us. You have the full information about the program, but I do want to maximize the time for our terrific speakers. So let me turn it over immediately to them. I know you have the instructions on how to submit questions through the Q&A function, and we will proceed right away with welcoming Julio for his opening remarks. Julio, welcome, and thank you so much, and over to you, sir.
Thank you, Satu. It's really lovely to be back with the East-West Center, albeit virtually at the moment. So good evening to everyone from Manila, and good day to all our colleagues in Washington, D.C. and in Asia who are here tonight. Let me first express my appreciation to the Korea Foundation and the East-West Center in Washington for making me a Korea Foundation Fellow at the center. This is my second stint at the East-West Center, and always good to be in touch with Satu, Sarah, and the rest of our colleagues at the East-West Center. They're such a magnificent and wonderful institution working on building better ties between our two regions. I will be completing the trilogy of presentations from my fellow East-West Center Korea Foundation colleagues, Sejong and Seth, by focusing on the defense and security aspect. So, could the United States, South Korea, and the Philippines work closely on strategic and defense matters? It is an inevitable question given the increasingly uncertain strategic environment. History and modern developments prove that a positive answer is possible. The three states and their respective relationships converged during the Korean War. It was during this conflict that all three fought for the principles of democracy centered on freedom and peaceful coexistence. The Battle of Yultung is evidence that the three states can face a common aggressor. And although it did not result in a trilateral security agreement, there are signs that since the Korean War, the three countries' relationships with each other have matured. It is natural for the three states to have converging and diverging interests. All three agree that the Indo-Pacific region should adhere to the rules-based international order and see states such as China and North Korea as risks to that order. However, prioritizations vary greatly between the three states. South Korea rightly prioritizes its neighbor, North Korea, as the immediate threat, whereas the Philippines is focused on China. The US is focused on both. Likewise, all three are committed to free and open seas. However, all three are also facing varying degrees of challenges in exemplifying that commitment. The Philippines, under the current administration, and South Korea under the Moon administration has tried to balance ties with the US and China, and the US has had difficulty in attaining open and vocal support from the two regional states. Bilateral defense and maritime cooperation are already evident among the three states. Of course, admittedly, it is fragmented. It is possible for a trilateral initiative to be built upon existing frameworks. Both the Philippines and South Korea are recipients of US support, and South Korea has contributed to the military modernization of the Philippines since 2019. The US and South Korea have both used the 2016 arbitration award won by the Philippines to reinforce the rule of law in the region and have reaffirmed their commitment to enhance Philippine security. With strong ties between and among the three countries, a trilateral initiative would then depend on two critical factors. First is the growing ties between the Philippines and South Korea, and the second is South Korea's increasing commitment to the region, that is to the Southeast Asian region that goes beyond peninsular affairs. However, there are several challenges that I think the three states should consider when they want a trilateral framework to happen. Firstly, they must all agree that they need a trilateral framework, and they need to agree on the values to emphasize and verbalize in the said framework, or at the very least, reach an informal arrangement that accommodates the concerns of all three countries. Second, the current capacities of each state need to be taken into consideration and as an opportunity for further specified cooperation. Third, the Philippines faces the additional problem of a poor defense posture that is currently reliant on foreign procurement and support. Negotiating the trilateral framework will most especially force the Philippines to re-examine its foreign policy towards East Asia. The fourth is that economic ties remain at the backseat. Apart from the need to increase the US economic footprint in the region, the Philippines and South Korea will have to catch up in finalizing a free trade agreement. Fifth, there will be inevitably resistances to any such trilateral framework. The views of South Korea's neighbors also need to be taken into consideration, as Japan, China, and even North Korea's reaction can potentially affect the whole region and subsequently peninsular affairs. While the above-mentioned elements make a trilateral initiative between the US, South Korea, and the Philippines a potential reality, however, the ever-evolving regional complexities of the South China Sea show that shared political history is just one ingredient, among many others, that makes initiatives and cooperation successful. There is a lot more that needs to be done before the three countries can enter some form of a trilateral initiative. Preliminary among this is the pursuit of stronger economic foundations between the three countries and throughout the region. The defense relations between the three countries are already in the early formative stages. Next, the three countries must informally work together on issues of key interest for all countries. These include maritime security, the fourth industrial technological transfers, anti-crime measures, climate change, HADR, and many others that could be taken as first steps in such a trilateral cooperation. Now, just as an example, South Korea's recent donation of the decommissioned Pohang-class corvette ROKS Andong, which is on top of its 2019 donation of another Pohang-class corvette, shows that Seoul is not only willing to play the defense diplomacy game, but it was also aware that the Philippines' weak maritime capacity will not allow the latter to play a critical role in any maritime-related incident. Manila and Washington have also proven that they could manage their way out of an alliance crisis. The recent joint statement that came out of a bilateral strategic dialogue held in November in Washington, D.C., robustly affirmed the alliance and identified areas where the two sides can work together most closely. Maritime incidents, for example, at Ayungin Shoal, where Chinese Coast Guards harassed the Philippines vessels that provide a regular supply of equipment and provisions to the Marines stationed at the BRP Sierra Madre, and the U.S. Strong statement of support proved that the two allies have learned some lessons in managing this important flashpoint. Before I conclude, let me note that the Philippines and South Korea will have their upcoming elections. In March, South Korea will have its elections and the Philippines will have its elections in May. And it should be noted that while in the past, foreign policy has never been an important election issue, it is an issue that is going to face the elected leaders of the two countries. And speaking on as an observer of Philippine elections, the 2022 May elections will prove to be important in the way that the US and that the Philippine foreign policy towards Northeast Asia and its ally will be managed and handled by the next administration. So while South Korea is a strong partner of the Philippines, at this point, it will be the US alliance that will again be a critical factor in how foreign policy is laid out by the next administration in July of this year. So the trilateral initiative between the US, South Korea, and the Philippines could only work when a trilateral framework is created where each member is aware of its role in the initiative. What role will South Korea, what role will the Philippines, and what role the US will play will be important. And transparency and cooperation will be reliant on the way that they understand the rules in such an initiative. Hence, what they are willing to include in such a trilateral framework and what compromises they make will be important as we move forward, as we try to look at the way that the US manages its Indo-Pacific policy and Korea maintains its New Southern policy, and the Philippines with its own policy, potential policy changes as 2022 election comes nearer. So, Satu, I did that. I was hoping I could speak for 15 minutes, but I think I could end here. Satu, you're on mute.
I do apologize. I forgot the mute button. But Julio, thank you very much. I want to pick up, and I think it'll come up in Q&A and discussion, I hope, about Korea and the Philippines both going to elections in the next couple of months, and so that's going to be important. And the other thing I want to just sort of, you mentioned the economic dimension, building on economics, and I want to hear more about that when we get to Q&A. But right now, let's turn to our colleague, Dr. Jae-Jook Park from Hankuk University for his comments, and then we can proceed from there. Please, Dr. Park.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Saturi Mae and Julio for inviting me to this important event. Thank you. Thanks, Julio, for your excellent presentations, and thank you for taking an initiative for trilateral security cooperation among South Korea, the Philippines, and the United States. So indeed, the trilateral among the three states has not been much discussed in the policy circles, partly because it is not clear, it is not clear for the three states what they can get from the trilateral security cooperation. So from South Korea's perspective, the main reason, there are three ways why South Korea should engage more security-wise with Southeast Asian states, including the Philippines. The first, enhancing security cooperation with Southeast Asian states, including the Philippines, is going to open the window for South Korea's arms exports. That's the first way to approach on this issue. Second is cooperating with Southeast Asian states, the South Korea can contribute to the strengthening of the US-led security network. Now, South Korea has been a firm believer in the US-led order. In order to preserve the US-led order, US-led security network should be enhanced. That's a second way to approach. The third way to approach South Korea's enhancement with security enhancement with Southeast Asian state is that it is an investment for US-South Korea alliance. Now, as we all know, since the failure of Hanoi talk, South Korea-US alliance has been weakened because the two states have very divergent approaches on North Korea. South Korea would like to retain North Korea on the negotiation table, while United States would impose sanctions on North Korea to give North Korea lessons for not fulfilling its commitment to nuclear non-proliferation. So US South Korea have divergent approaches on North Korea, so that US ROK alliance has been weakened. So that from South Korea's perspective, South Korea's enhancing security engagement with Southeast Asian states is an investment for the US ROK alliance. That is, South Korea would like to compromise its position on South China Sea issue in order to accommodate the US security interest. In return, South Korea expects the United States to make a more commitment on the US ROK alliance. So there are three different approaches. So if you suggest a trilateral security cooperation among South Korea, US, and the Philippines, not quite sure, among the three approaches, which one South Korea would like to prefer. I guess it seems to me that Julio, you approach this from the perspective of strengthening US-led security network. But South Korea, at least the current South Korean government, current South Korean government may approach on this from the perspective of investing for the US South Korea alliance. So in order to invest in order to ensure for the US ROK alliance, South Korea might welcome the initiative for the trilateral security cooperation among the three states. So in other words, there are going to be some limitations to the degree South Korea would engage in this trilateral security cooperations, because South Korea does not, at least the current South Korean government does not want to unnecessarily provoke China. The Philippines as an issue, territorial issue with China, so that from South Korea's perspective, strengthening the trilateral security cooperation among the three states may unnecessarily provoke China, so that we may not fully engage in this trilaterals. I think that's the reason why there has not been much discussion among the policy circles in South Korea about this particular trilateral among South Korea, US, and the Philippines. Now, all that said, as Julio, you pointed out, the bilateral relationship between South Korea, United States, and bilateral relationship between the Philippines and United States are strong. They are allies. They are allies. So that South Korea, if South Korea, the security relationship between South Korea and the Philippines is to be enhanced, then there is a big potential for trilateral cooperation among the three states. So in this context, I would suggest that, how we can utilize the Balikatan military exercise between the Philippines and the United States. In 2000, I understand that 2018, Japan participated in the Balikatan military exercises. 2019, Australia joined the Balikatan military exercises. And I also understand that South Korea participated in the Balikatan as an observer in 2019. We all know 2020 was canceled due to the corona, COVID-19. And this year it was resumed, but is not in full scale. But I read in newspaper article that the Philippine government is planning to resume the Balikatan military exercises next year, full scale. And then UK might join the Balikatan military exercises. So South Korea, the US, Japan, and Australia, they have been contributing to maritime capacity building in the Philippines. All the four states have been donating used ships and airplanes to the Philippines. And the Philippines has been renovating, upgrading those donated items. So Balikatan military exercises might be a good venue for, like a 3 states or 4 states join and enhance interoperabilities among, those donated items, the ships and airplanes. So at least there is an, excuse. There is an, justification, if not an excuse, for the 4 states to get together and conduct joint military exercises. I think this is one area we may think of in order to facilitate the trilateral security cooperation among the 3 states. But the second area I think might be a good good in facilitating the trilateral among the 3 states is a Coast Guard cooperations. The United States has set up the Philippine Coast. The United States has set up the Coast Guard watch system in the Philippines that is for the maritime domain awareness. And South Korea is a very advanced country in high tech, also a very advanced country in satellite technologies. So that may be an area where the 3 states get together and cooperate with each other. So United States has been trying to enhance ISR capabilities among Southeast Asian states. United States has been donating to not only the used airplanes, but also very high-tech drones. Not only the Philippines, but also the Malaysia and Indonesia. So US has been very much interested in enhancing ISR capabilities of the Southeast Asian states. Now, I suspect that in the end, the United States would like to induce Southeast Asian states to the US-led security network under the name of intelligence cooperation. So in that context, South Korea, United States, and the Philippines might cooperate in order to enhance the Philippines' coastal watch system, which has been set up by the United States. And recently, it has been issued in South Korea. That US has a plan to set up information fusion center, for USFK, US Forces Korea. So I think US has a grand plan of connecting all the regions, Northeast Asia, Southeast Asia, through intelligence and information sharing. So I think that gives a room for the 3 states cooperate in trilateral setting. So before I end my discussion, I would like to ask Julio that, what would you expect from the trilateral security cooperation? So what would you expect from South Korea? Now, as you pointed out, their security interests are very divergent. South Korea has been very focused on the peninsula issues. The Philippines territorial disputes the Philippines is interested in territorial dispute with China. South Korea, in principle, supposed the rule of law, the free navigation in South China Sea. But we have been very reluctant to sending troops to South China Sea in order to join the US freedom of navigation operations. So I don't think South Korea is going to, engage in any, military dispute or confrontation between China and the Philippines. I don't expect the Philippines to engage in, dispute between military confrontation between South Korea and North Korea, or South Korea and China in the West Sea. So in the end, I was wondering what, Julio, you think that the Philippines can expect from South Korea by facilitating the trilateral cooperation, and on the flip side of it, what do you expect from South Korea with respect to trilateral security cooperation among the three states. So I'll stop here. And looking forward to our discussion.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Park. That was very interesting for me in two respects. One is that you started out with three broad areas that could have been driving Korea's policy towards Philippines. Arms exports, contribute to a US-led network, investment in the US-ROK alliance. And then you touched on two specific areas where there could be actual tangible functional work between Philippines, US, and Korea, Balakatan and the Coastal Watch System. So I hope we'll take these issues up. But before we move it over to Q&A, and I invite Q&A at this point, I would like to give Julio just a chance to respond if he has any questions before taking up some queries.
Thanks, thanks, Atu, and thanks, Dr. Park. I think Dr. Park really provided a comprehensive analysis of where the problems lie when it comes to trilateral cooperation, but it also pointed to some great ideas where such cooperation works. First of all, let me start by saying that any improvement between Philippines-South Korea defense relations and any improvement between US-South Korea relations and Philippine-US relations are always for the good when it comes to regional security. So individually, bilaterally, anything that improves each other's security and defense relations are all positives for the region and for the alliance system as a whole. So that should not be underestimated. And again, any trilateral framework will not be very advanced at this point. It's only going to be a starting point for further cooperation. But it all this will be hinged on really good bilateral relations among all the countries involved. But to answer Dr. Park's point, really the first discussion about what is expected of South Korea is not just with the Philippines. It's a concern, I think, shared regionally. When the new Southern policy came up, one of the questions that was always, I think when we were discussing this before, was that every time South Korea attends ASEAN forums, it wants ASEAN to say something on the Korean Peninsula. But when ASEAN asks South Korea to say something on our issues, and during that time, a decade ago, I think on the South China Sea, we couldn't expect any more from South Korea except some tepid response on commitment to rule of law. So there was that imbalance in perceptions that Southeast Asia was willing to speak up on South Korean issues, but the reverse seems to be not true. So I think that is a continuing challenge today. The second is that despite having no alliance relations, again, historically, the Philippines has already proven that when called upon by a US ally, we will be there, right? We were there already, we faced that. So, and I think South Korea recognizes the way that the Philippines has shed blood on its soil decades ago. But more importantly, I think South Korea's approach to defense diplomacy, particularly military sales, is quite important for a country like the Philippines. I think there's recognition in the Philippines that we cannot just cannot absorb high-tech US equipment. There needs to be a stepping stone, and Korea is well placed to be that stepping stone for military modernization. And Korea's investments, whether it's through donation or through military deals that redound to the Philippines good, are actually quite appreciated here. So I think moving forward, the main issue is, is the Philippines just going to be a recipient of Korean weapons, or is there a chance for deeper cooperation through technology transfer? I think that's a critical question that needs to be answered, because again, buying Korean equipment is good, but maybe it's time to start also letting the Philippines in on the technology so that we can also develop. Again, anything that develops bilateral security relations will redound to the good of the alliance system, whether you apply it to Northeast Asia or Southeast Asia. Setu, you're on mute again.
Yes, thank you, Julio. And there is a question here that's been submitted by a colleague. Great discussion regarding economic cooperation. What are the prospects for closer trilateral cooperation if there continues to be no role for the United States in the regional economic architecture, CPTPP, RCEP, et cetera? would a solely security-focused posture by the U.S. limit the growing trilateral unnecessarily? So there are some questions there, and I think they're important ones, because my question also for Dr. Park really was, we hear, Korea, of the many reasons Korea is important to the region. One of them is its sort of incredible economic growth and development as an economy over the last 2 decades. And it's recently hinted at joining CPTPP. It has a very robust investment and trade profile, and I wondered how that would play. So this question picks up on the same question I had for you as well. So why don't we start with Dr. Park on this one and then go to Julio as well. Dr. Park?
Yes, yes. CPTPP, I think South Korea is going to South Korean National Assembly hasn't ratified this CPTPP yet, so that we are not going to join the CPTPP from the very beginning. So we already missed I think it has already started from the first day of January from several states. But we still, but we are going to, the National Assembly is going to join the CPTPP soon, so that we expect to join it, I think, later this year. But the thing is that in South Korea, we still see the CPTPP in rival with RCEP. No, sorry. I'm confused. I was talking about the RCEP. So we joined the RCEP, but the South Korean National Assembly hasn't ratified the RCEP yet. And then I think we are going to submit our application for CPTPP soon. But the thing is that in South Korea, we still see this as a competition. There is a competition between RCEP and CPTPP. So I think it will hinge upon the result of the next presidential election, whether South Korea is going to fully submit its application to CPTPP or not. So we have to wait and see how it is going to fan out South Korea economic foreign policy. So you are muted.
Julio, you mentioned also building an economic base. And I want to ask both of you on this economic base issue to describe a little bit about Korea-Philippines economic trade and investment ties and what opportunities might exist to shore that up, particularly given the ICT capabilities of Korea, 5G and high-tech equipment, semiconductors, all kinds of issues where Korea plays an important role.
Thanks, Satu. I think the Philippines and South Korea, in fact, have signed or have finalized at the very least a free trade agreement and probably waiting for ratification. I think this is a very big step on the part of the two countries to really engage with each other economically. So the trade agreement covers trade in goods, trade remedies, rules of origin, competition, and chapters under legal institutional issues already. And this is definitely a good building block for closer Philippine-South Korea relations. Not to mention, of course, the huge people-to-people ties between the two countries. We do host a lot of South Koreans here and vice versa. So I think we do have a good economic avenue for deepening Philippine-South Korea relations. But then that goes again to the earlier question whether a purely military or security agreement would be difficult at the moment. And I would agree that one of the things that was really that Southeast Asia was looking for in terms of U.S. commitment is not so much the security aspect, because we know it's there. The commitments have been made, the statements have been made, the presence is there, but the economic presence, the economic policy, the economic framework for the U.S. Indo-Pacific is really a missing chunk, despite the visits of very senior government officials from the US, from the Vice President to the Secretary of State. I think the missing piece is really the economic aspect, and that is something I think that we need to see soon. You know, our CEP, it's on its way to full implementation with many governments already ratifying it through their constitutional processes. The Philippines is definitely on board our CEP. So what happens next would be the implementation. Of course, that would be difficult, but at least we have the framework. CPTPP is there. But again, the question is, where will be the US in that other very critical aspect of Indo-Pacific policy?
Thank you, Julio. There's one other question here. It's really not about the Philippines, but you know, we are, this entire Korea Foundation supported effort is on trilateral US, Korea, Southeast Asia. And though this particular seminar looks at Philippines as sort of kind of a case study, I do wonder if this question is about engaging Thailand as well. And I just wondered if Dr. Park particularly had any comments on this. You know, how does, you know, given your area of work, do you want to say anything about Korea's relations with US ally Thailand in this context, or you have any thoughts?
From South Korea's perspective, I think it's more comfortable in facilitating, you know, sorry, Julia, but more comfortable in facilitating South Korea, Thailand, US trilateral rather than US Thailand, so US South Korea, the Philippines trilateral. That is because, you know, Thailand has been working a very fine line between China and the United States, and Thailand does not have any territorial dispute with China yet. So Thailand does not have a territorial dispute with China. So in that context, it's relatively more comfortable for South Korea to facilitate a trilateral with US and Thailand than US and the Philippines. I think that's the part of the reasons why South Korea has been more actively participating in Cobra Gold rather than Balikatan. You know, South Korea has been almost regularly sending troops to Cobra Gold, but in case of the Balikatan, South Korea, you know, though South Korea participated in Balikatan as an observer in 2019, then I think South Korea is not fully willing to be a part of the Balikatan yet, because, you know, we know that, you know, the Philippines has an territorial issue with China. So at least, you know, so the current South Korean government does not want to be involved in unnecessary dispute between China on the one hand and Southeast Asia on the other hand.
Any thoughts, Julio, on your part about this question?
Yeah.
And Dr. Park's response, yeah.
Yeah, I fully agree with Dr. Park that from I think probably from a South Korean perspective, it's less contentious to engage Thailand. But as an observer of Southeast Asia and ASEAN, I think the question here is not so much between Thailand and South Korea. It's really between the US and Thailand, given that among the US allies in the region, Thailand has been, you know, I mean, for the most part, basically frozen out of the system, and whether that's good or bad, we still don't know yet. But again, so I see that from that perspective rather than a South Korea Thailand issue. It's really a US Thailand issue. But again, that question of cooperation on the military aspect shows that where, you know, there is no territorial dispute, South Korea is willing to join the exercises. But I also don't think it's going to hinder South Korea if it's fully invited to participate in Balikatan, because there are many aspects of Balikatan that does improve the interoperability between and among allied countries with the US. So I do think it's a more of an issue of South Korea not being fully invited to participate rather than not willing to participate, although we need to check that one. But I guess it's more of that rather than not willing, but really not being fully invited at the moment to participate. And we don't know yet, given the conditions, but maybe who knows what can happen in 2023.
I'd like to we wait for additional questions to come. I have one question that I've been keeping to ask you, and that relates to societal ties between Korea and the Philippines. At one point, if I'm not mistaken, I may be mistaken, I believe there was a Filipino-Korean member of the National Assembly at one point elected to the National Assembly. I understand that there are exchanges of migration between the two countries, immigrants. So can you say a little bit more about the kind of how does South Korean soft power, the music and culture and those kinds of things play in the Philippines? What kinds of interest is there in Korea for tourism? In the Philippines, some of the beautiful islands and beaches, etc. So I'd like to know a little bit more just about building ties beyond defense and trade agreements. What's the current state of thinking about this? Please. I know that COVID has created a lot of restrictions, but I mean, in general, what are the societal relations between Korea and Philippines, and how are they developing?
Yes, so that's a great question because I remember a joke before when I think it was President Lim Bak who made a state visit to the Philippines. And the running joke was that he was here to visit half of his voting population. Because during that time, it was the height of the Korean wave going to the Philippines. And we still do have a strong presence of Koreans in the Philippines. The fact that we have Korean towns in various provinces of the country really shows the influence and the presence of South Korea, I think, which really does need to be emphasized here, that while we're looking to strengthen and while the defense and military ties are already quite strong between the Philippines and South Korea, we also have the social aspect to it, which is also, I think, very important. We've also noted that there was, this was pre-COVID, that there was an increase in the number of South Korean students coming into the Philippines because they said that a degree from one of our major universities is recognized in South Korea, but they don't have to pay as much. So we had that increase. In fact, I had several students when I was teaching before, many Korean students, because they saw the value of the Philippine degrees, because they know that many of the professors in some of the big universities were educated in the US, so they saw value in that, but they saw the cost of living as well as a very good attraction. It was very attractive to them to live in Manila with the prices were much lower than that in Seoul. So we should not discount these people-to-people relations. They are increasing. The Philippines is one of the strongest supporters of Korean K-pop. I mean, BTS Army is very strong here among various groups. So I do think that kind of social attraction is quite good for both countries. I know that there are many Filipino students now studying in South Korea, and South Korea was a very popular destination for tourists before COVID. So we should not discount this. So the question then is, how do we improve, or how do we build on this again for a trilateral approach? Because we do have this where through various State Department initiatives, you have people coming to the Philippines and then visiting another Southeast Asian country, but we don't have a trilateral initiative where scholars and experts can visit, Northeast Asia and Southeast Asia at the same time. We haven't seen that much, and I think there's room there for those kind of people-to-people networking.
Yeah, there may be a way to affiliate that with the Waisili program, for example, to draw Koreans into that. Yes. Dr. Park, do you have any thoughts, sir?
I agree with Julio that people-to-people exchange has been people-to-people exchange has been increasing. Now, especially Julio mentioned English education. For South Koreans, the Philippines is an alternative. So sorry, but it's an alternative place to learn English. the Koreans, they prefer to be educated in the US or UK or in Australia. But as Julio pointed out, given that living prices and tuition is very low, relatively low, so in the Philippines. So we consider Philippines as an alternative place to learn English. And I know I have a friends who learn English by phone conversation, based in the Philippines. So there's a sources for increased people to people exchange, but in South Korea we're also aware that there are some South Koreans are very notorious that in the Philippines they live with the Philippine female, and they give birth to a child, and they don't take care of those children, and that has been an issue in the Philippines. We understand, but I think so we shouldn't do that. So in order to improve the people to people exchanges, there are things that we should change, that they should be changed.
Thank you. Thank you. We also have another question that I want to take up from Juhee Jong. Thank you both for your great presentations. With both countries facing presidential elections, and this came up earlier, but let's pull the thread on this a bit more. Do you think the new president's perspectives, both, I take it both in Korea and in Philippines, on US-China relations, decoupling or conflict, as people are saying, will affect relations between Korea and the Philippines? I mean, Julio, I want to, what kind of changes do you expect? Our colleague asks in the Q&A, but I want to be a little bit more specific on that. And it's a great question. Currently, if the elections were held today, we understand, Julio, that Mr. Marcos is in the front runner. I mean, it's politics, it's elections, so we don't know, but if you had to guess today, he's the leading candidate. And people say that he's, not likely to change much from trying to manage relations with China very closely. And I wondered what your assessment of that is, to the extent you could say, and what the vice president's views are, or any other major candidates you think. But the audience would like to know sort of, can we expect a real significant change in recent Philippine behavior in the US-China relationship? And same with South Korea. I mean, this kind of ebbs and flows, goes back and forth, more on North Korea policy, I would say, than on China. But nevertheless, it does come up. So could we hear a little bit more about that from each of you, starting with Julio?
Thanks, Satu. It's a great question, a tricky question given the situation. But yes, it's no secret that the Marcos family has strong relations with China. Of course, President Marcos was key to the sort of opening between China and the Philippines. And of course, the family has kept personal ties with China. So do we expect that there would be another change? I mean, the late Professor Babiara noted that the Philippines keeps on swinging every 6 years, right? But I think the last years of this administration shows that there are really strong ties between the Philippines and the US. And when the US becomes responsive to Philippine demands, as it were, it does make both sides able to work creatively around political issues. And I think the failure of China to realize a lot of their projects, the high-handed approach to the continuing high-handed approach to the South China Sea, not giving an inch on the bogus 9-line claim, and of course, the fact that during this pandemic, the sales of Chinese vaccines were higher than the donations. I think the impact on the public is quite strong, and I don't think that any future or the next administration, whoever it is, will try to force the Philippines out of its current strong ties with the US. there might be some creative way of ensuring that we don't, I mean, there's this issue about us being independent, having an independent foreign policy. But I think for the most part, on the security aspect, on which country is seen as a true friend, I think the US has proven that it can adjust and it can be responsive to the concerns of its junior ally. So that's where I see things going. Whoever wins, that we're not going to swing wildly this time. That there would be a more tepid approach to this. Um, Also, obviously, trying to make some space for dealing with China, because it's just a reality that we have to live with. But at the same time, I think recent experience with the US has shown that the two allies could make it work.
Thank you, Julio. Dr. Park.
In South Korea now, the presidential race is very neck and neck. No one knows who is going to win. But if the Yoon, the ex prosecutor Yoon wins the election, then South Korea is going to more South Korea is going to more leaning toward the United States, strengthening the US-led security network. So it means that South Korea, there is going to be more chances for such trilaterals like the one between South Korea, the Philippines, and the United States. Yoon has been clearly making a case that South Korea should join Quad Plus, which means that South Korea is going to fully participate in, fully cooperating with the United States in pursuing the Indo-Pacific strategy. But Lee Jae-myung is going, if Lee Jae-myung wins the election, then I think there will be the continuation. Of course, there will be the continuation of the current government. So it means that South Korea is going to facilitate the unilateral security cooperations in the region, but unilateral security cooperations among the indigenous, what I call the indigenous unilateral security cooperation. That is this unilateral security cooperation among the regional states in order to mitigate the tension between China and the United States. So South Korea is not going to fully participating in US-led unilateral security cooperations, such as the one between South Korea, the Philippines, and the United States. Rather, South Korea would be more interested in unilateral security cooperation among the regional states, like South Korea and some Southeast Asian states, not necessarily involving the United States.
Thank you both. I know we're close to a 9:30 mark, and I don't see any other additional questions in the chat and QA at this juncture. So I want to just flag a couple of things I noticed that didn't come up, but I hope will inform your further research. And I'd be very interested in perhaps cooperating on this in the future. One is, if I may say, both Philippines obviously is a majority Christian country. And South Korea, of course, has a considerable number of Christians. And I wondered if there were any societal ties between the churches in the two countries as a matter of people to people and civic society relations. It also didn't come up much, but didn't come up much in this particular discussion. But Korea and Philippines are democracies. Like many democracies, they have all kinds of challenges and issues, but they do share these fundamental values of individual liberties, of press, assembly, etc. So, it struck me that on the societal front, quite apart from defense diplomacy, security ties, maritime security cooperation, real issues, important issues, there might be some additional opportunities to work on these kind of societal and civic and cultural ties between US, Korea, and Southeast Asia. And it's a real important area of the East-West Center's work, as you all know. We are not only focused on foreign policy, defense, or security, but also on these kinds of society to society issues. And so I hope you'll think about adding that to your portfolio. But in closing, let me also say that one of the goals of this very graciously and generously funded Korea Foundation effort on US-Korea Southeast Asia ties is to build just precisely these connections between scholars, analysts, and others in Korea, the US, and in Southeast Asia. And I'm so very grateful that both of you could join our program today. I'm sorry that Dr. Hook from Malaysia could not join us today. She must have had some technical problem, and I certainly hope she's in good health and good spirits. But building these networks so that we can continue to develop a network between the United States, Korea, and Southeast Asia is really important. And let me close by thanking both of you, and again, the Korea Foundation, for the opportunity to develop such networks and to build on them in the future. Please join us tomorrow. We will have Professor Bertrand talking about his new book on a discussion, and Sarah Wong has put the information, but it's a latest book concerning democracy and nationalism in Southeast Asia and its role in reducing secessionist conflicts. So if you're able to join us or alert your colleagues to this, this program tomorrow, we welcome you joining us. But thank you. I know it's very late in Korea and Manila, so thank you for staying up late, for all of you who joined us and our presenters. And I bid you good day, good evening, and look forward to seeing you again at the East-West Center. Thank you. Bye-bye.